The imperial spire of Vorthak Prime rose 9 kilometers into a violet sky, and every centimeter of it had been engineered to make visitors feel small. Ambassador Alina Reyes walked through its outer gates with a paper coffee cup in one hand and a worn leather satchel slung over her shoulder. She was 46 years old, 5'6", and entirely uninterested in the architecture. Behind her, 6 Vorthak honor guards in obsidian armor stamped in perfect synchrony, the sound echoing off walls carved from a single piece of asteroid jade. The procession had been designed across centuries to humble emperors. Alina sipped her coffee and made a small face at the temperature. "It's gone cold," she murmured to her aide, a young man named Davies who walked half a step behind her with a tablet pressed to his chest. "Remind me to mention that in the report." "The cold coffee, ma'am, or the 9-kilometer tower?" "The coffee, the tower's their problem." Davies made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. They were led into the Hall of Suns, a chamber so vast that the ceiling held a working orrery of every system the Vorthak Imperium had conquered in 12,000 years. 40,000 worlds, 40,000 small, slow-turning lights. The light from them painted the floor in shifting amber and green, and as Alina crossed it, the lights moved with her, as though the stars themselves were tracking the intruder. At the far end of the hall, on a throne of fused warship hulls, sat High Lord Tarsus Vale, a being 8 feet tall, 4-armed, with a crown of bone fused directly into his skull. He had personally executed the surrender of 3 civilizations. His name, in 17 languages, was a verb meaning to end. The imperial court ringed him in concentric tiers, generals, inquisitors, the ambassadors of vassal states, kneeling. Some of those vassals had been kneeling for so many generations that their species had evolved knee structures specifically for it. Alina stopped at the diplomatic mark, a circle of silver inlaid in the stone, placed precisely so that any standing visitor's eyeline met the High Lord's chest, never his face. She glanced at the circle, then walked 3 paces past it and stopped where the floor was just floor and looked the High Lord squarely in the eye. A ripple went through the court. One of the inquisitors made a strangled noise. High Lord Tarsus Vale regarded her for a long, long moment. Then he smiled, which on a Vorthak face involved the lower jaw splitting into 3 parts. "Human," he said, and his voice rolled through the hall like a slow avalanche. "You have been summoned to receive the judgment of the Imperium upon your species. Listen well, for I will not repeat myself." Alina tilted her head politely and took another sip of cold coffee. "The Imperium," Tarsus Vale continued, "has surveyed your homeworld. We have noted its mineral wealth. We have noted its biosphere. We have noted with some amusement your defenses." A low chuckle moved through the tiers of the court, the practiced laugh of beings who had laughed at the defenses of 40,000 worlds. "You will surrender Saul's resource rights to the imperial crown. Your population will be relocated to designated continents. Your fleet will be dismantled. You have 1 rotation of your homeworld to comply." He leaned forward, all 4 hands gripping the arms of his throne. "Refuse and we will erase your species from the stellar record. There will be no negotiations. There will be no second offer. There will be only the war, and after the war, only the silence." The 40,000 small suns above them pulsed once, in unison, on cue. It was a speech that had been delivered, with minor variations, 211 times across the Empire's history. 211 civilizations had wept or screamed or thrown themselves at the throne for mercy, or, in 3 memorable cases, attempted assassination and been atomized mid-leap. Ambassador Alina Reyes did not weep. She did not scream. She glanced down at her coffee cup, frowned slightly at how much was left, and looked back up at the High Lord with the polite, slightly tired expression of a woman who had been pulled out of a perfectly good lunch meeting for this. "I'm sorry," she said. "Could you repeat the part after amusement? I think I missed it." The Hall of Suns went very, very quiet. The silence in the Hall of Suns was not the silence of awe. It was the silence of 40,000 worlds worth of courtiers collectively trying to decide whether they had just heard what they thought they had heard. High Lord Tarsus Vale's lower jaw closed slowly back into a single piece. The amber light of the orrery slid across his face. "You wish me," he said carefully, as though speaking to a very small and very stupid child, "to repeat the threat of your extinction." Just the second half, Alina said. I was distracted by the lights. They're very nice, by the way, the orrery. Is that a HFY design? It is. Thought so. The HFY do beautiful astronomical work. Did beautiful astronomical work. She offered him a small, apologetic smile. I always forget which tense to use with vassal cultures. So sorry. Please continue. Davies behind her had gone the color of old paper. The aide's tablet was shaking faintly in his hands. He was, Alina noted distantly, doing very well. The first time she had stood in a room like this, 20 years ago, she had vomited on a Krell diplomat's foot. They had become quite good friends afterward, before the Imperium had glassed Krell. High Lord Tarsus Vale rose from his throne. He rose and rose and rose, until all 8 feet of him stood silhouetted against the artificial galaxy on the ceiling, and 4 arms spread wide, and his voice when it came was no longer the careful avalanche but the full thunder for which he was famous on 300 conquered worlds. You will comply, he said, or you will die. Choose, now. Alina set her coffee cup down on the silver diplomatic mark behind her. She straightened her jacket. She walked forward another 2 paces, past the unspoken second line that no ambassador had ever crossed, and stopped close enough to the throne dais that the honor guard's weapons began to hum. She looked up at him, a small woman in a plain gray suit, looking up at a god of war. High Lord, she said, and her voice was not loud, but it carried the way certain voices do when they have stopped pretending. I am going to say 7 words to you. I would like you to remember them, not for my sake, for yours. The court did not breathe. You have, she said, already lost. You don't know it yet. That was 8 words, technically. Tarsus Vale did not bother to point this out. He was, for the first time in 900 years, not entirely sure what to say. Alina turned. She picked up her coffee cup. She nodded politely to the orrery, as one might nod to a nice piece of furniture in a stranger's home, and she walked out of the Hall of Suns at the unhurried pace of a woman heading back to a meeting she found marginally more interesting. Davies hurried after her. The honor guards, who had received no countermanding order, fell in step on instinct. Behind them in the great hall, High Lord Tarsus Vale stood very still for a long moment. Then he lifted one of his 4 hands. General Corps, he said. A figure stepped forward from the inner ring, a Vorthak in the silver and black of the 8th Imperial Fleet. 12 campaigns, 41 billion casualties on his record, a number that had earned him 3 promotions and a moon. Take the 8th, Tarsus Vale said, and the 12th, and the Reaver detachment. Go to Sol, do not negotiate, do not accept surrender, burn the homeworld and salt the orbit. I want their son to outlive their memory. By your will, Corps said, and was already turning. In general, Tarsus Vale's voice followed him. The ambassador, detain her. I want her alive when the news of her world's death reaches her. I want to see her face when she understands. By your will. The general was gone. The orders rippled outward through the spire on coded channels, and within minutes, in the orbital yards above Vorthak Prime, 640 warships began to wake. Far below, in a shuttle bay on the spire's lower levels, Alina Reyes paused beside her diplomatic transport. She looked at her wristpiece. A single green dot pulsed on it, soft as a heartbeat. Davies, she said quietly, send the signal. Ma'am, we're being detained any second. They'll send the signal. Davies sent the signal. 3 light-years away, in the cold dark between stars, something very large and very patient opened its eyes. The 8th Imperial Fleet translated into the Sol system at 3:14 ship time, in formation, in glory, in the full and well-rehearsed certainty of beings who had done this 211 times before. General Corps stood on the command bridge of the Crown of Ash, his flagship, and watched the blue dot of Earth resolve on the main display. It was a pretty world. He had always thought in his quiet moments that the prettier worlds tended to scream the loudest. There was, he suspected, a thesis in there somewhere, but he had never been a writing man. Sensor sweep, he said. Sweeping, General. The bridge officers worked in the familiar rhythm. Mineral surveys, population centers, defense grid. The Imperium's intelligence file on humanity was 400 years old and had been updated, the analysts believed, as recently as a decade ago. The file said 1 homeworld, 3 off-world colonies of negligible size, fleet of approximately 200 sublight-capable warships, no FTL military assets, primitive shielding, projected resistance time, 90 to 120 minutes. Core had budgeted 3 hours to be generous. General, the sensor officer's voice had a quality in it that Core did not, at first, recognize. He had not heard it from a Vorthak military officer in his entire career. It took him a moment to place it. It was uncertainty. Report. Sir, the sweep is, sir, it's coming back wrong. Define wrong. The mineral readings on Earth are there low, sir, significantly low, as though most of it has been moved. Moved. Mined out, sir, decades ago by the Strata patterns, and there's no evidence of where it went, no orbital industry of that scale, it's just gone. Core stepped closer to the display. Continue. The off-world colonies, sir, Mars, Europa, the Belt installations, they register as general, they register as decoys, heat signatures only, the structures are hollow. There's nothing there but warm rocks broadcasting on the right frequencies. A small, cold thing began to uncoil in General Core's chest. He had not felt this particular sensation since he was a cadet. He found, with some surprise, that he had not missed it. And the fleet, he said, the 200 sublight ships. The sensor officer was silent for several seconds. Sir, we aren't reading 200 ships. How many? None, sir. None. No human warships in the Sol system, General, anywhere. We're reading civilian traffic, cargo haulers, a few passenger liners, there's a school transport near Luna. A pause. Sir, where are their warships? General Core was a creature of 41 billion casualties and 12 successful campaigns, and he had not become those things by being slow. He turned to his communications officer. Open a channel to Vorthak Prime, priority red, tell the High Lord. General. This was a different officer, the tactical chief, an older Vorthak named Vesh, who had served under 3 High Lords and had once survived an assassination attempt by drinking the poison and waiting calmly for his own liver to compensate. His voice was level. It was always level. That was why Core noticed when it wasn't. General, I have new contacts. How many? Working. How many tactical? Vesh looked up from the display, and General Core saw in the older Vorthak's face an expression he had personally put on the faces of 200 enemy commanders across a long career and had never expected to see worn by one of his own. All of them, sir, Vesh said quietly. I'm reading all of them. The display updated. Around the 8th Imperial Fleet, in a sphere a light minute across, points of light were resolving out of the dark. Not dozens, not hundreds. The number ticked upward and kept ticking past every threshold of meaning. 3,000, 6,009. The points of light were not running hot, they were not broadcasting. They had been there, Core realized with a slow, sick clarity, the entire time the fleet had been completing its sweep. The humans had let them finish reading the empty file. The points of light were hulls, cold-running, stealth-shielded, mass-manufactured hulls, and every single one of them had a firing solution on the crown of ash. Core opened his mouth to give an order. He never found out which one. The communications array died first, then the engines, then the lights. In the silent dark of his bridge, General Core of the 8th Imperial Fleet had just enough time to remember, with sudden and perfect clarity, the 7 words the human ambassador had said in the Hall of Suns, before something very large and very patient finished what it had opened its eyes to do. It was 16 hours before the Imperium understood that the 8th Fleet was gone. Not destroyed, gone. There were no debris fields, no distress beacons, no final transmissions. The 12th, following in slower formation, arrived at the agreed rendezvous point and found nothing, not a hull, not a corpse, not a single charged particle that suggested anything had ever been fought there. The Reaver detachment turned back before reaching Sol on the personal order of its commander, who later, during her debrief on Vorthak Prime, used a word from a vassal language that translated, imperfectly, as the wrongness of an empty shore where the tide should be. In the Imperial spire, the news climbed the chain of command with the slow, viscous reluctance of bad tidings on a world where the messengers of bad tidings had, historically, been eaten. It reached High Lord Tarsus Vale at the 17th hour. He was, at the time, watching a recording of Ambassador Reyes' exit from the Hall of Suns, on loop, for the 11th time. He listened to the report in silence. He did not move when it ended. He did not move for a long time after. Then he said very quietly, "Bring me the human." Elena Reyes was, at that moment, in a detention suite 3 levels below the spire. The Imperium's detention suites for high-status prisoners were luxurious by design, soft lighting, comfortable furniture, a full menu, because the Imperium had learned across 12,000 years that comfortable prisoners gave better intelligence than tortured ones, and because the spectacle of a once-proud ambassador weeping into silk was useful court theater. Elena had eaten a perfectly acceptable bowl of soup, taken a nap, and was now sitting cross-legged on the floor doing a crossword puzzle on a folded printout she had produced from her satchel. Davies sat against the opposite wall, watching the door, vibrating slightly. "Ma'am," he said for what might have been the 100th time, "they are going to come in here, and they are going to—" 6 letters, Elena said. "Italian for tomorrow, starts with D." "Domani." "Thank you," she wrote it in. "They're not going to do anything to us, Davies." "With respect, ma'am, they absolutely are." "They were," she allowed. 16 hours ago, they were going to make a great show of it. Now they're going to come in here very politely and ask me a question, and I'm going to answer it, and then we're going to go for a walk." "A walk? That might sound—" The door opened. The Vorthak honor guards who entered did not raise their weapons. They did not, in fact, look at Elena at all. They looked at the floor in front of her, which was, Elena knew, a Vorthak gesture of profound disquiet, a way of acknowledging a presence without granting it the dignity of eye contact, used historically when approaching things that were not, strictly speaking, supposed to exist. "Ambassador," the lead guard said, "the High Lord requests your attendance." "Of course," Elena said. She folded the crossword. She stood. She picked up her satchel. "Davies, finish your tea." Davies had not been drinking tea. There was no tea. He stood up anyway. They walked back through the spire in a procession that was, this time, very different from the first. The honor guards did not stamp. The corridors had been cleared. Word had begun to filter outward, in the way that words do in any court, half rumor, half prayer, and the courtiers who pressed themselves into alcoves to watch the small woman pass did so with expressions that were no longer amused. The Hall of Suns, when she entered it, was nearly empty. The orrery still turned overhead. The 40,000 worlds still pulsed, but the tiers of generals and inquisitors and kneeling vassals were gone. Only Tarsus Vale remained on his throne of worship hulls, and a single advisor at his elbow, an old Vorthak with milky eyes and a robe so dark it seemed to drink the amber light. Elena walked to the silver mark, then past it, then past the second mark she had crossed last time. She kept walking until she stood at the foot of the throne dais itself, close enough to touch. "High Lord," she said. Tarsus Vale looked down at her. There was no thunder in him now. There was something much older and much quieter, the look of a being who had just understood, for the first time in his long life, that he was inside a story he had not been writing. "Ambassador," he said, "what did you do?" Elena smiled gently and not unkindly. "High Lord," she said, "we should probably have a longer conversation." Tarsus Vale dismissed the advisor with a flick of one of his 4 hands. The old Vorthak bowed and withdrew without a sound, and the great doors of the Hall of Suns closed behind him with a finality that, Elena thought, was probably meant to be ominous and would have been in any other meeting. "Sit," Tarsus Vale said. There were no chairs in the Hall of Suns. No one sat in the Hall of Suns. The High Lord's throne was the only seat in the chamber, and to sit anywhere else was to claim a peer's right to comfort in his presence. A chair rose silently out of the floor at Elena's feet. The spire's architects, 12,000 years dead, had built that mechanism for a reason none of them had ever expected to see used. Elena sat. She set her satchel on her lap. She looked up at the High Lord and waited. "Speak," Tarsus Vale said. "The 8th Fleet." "Boarded," Elena said. "Disabled. Crews are alive. They're being held in deep space facilities. Their officers are being interviewed, politely. I'd like to emphasize that, politely." 640 warships. "Yes. Held." Stealth hulls, cold-running drives, mass production over the last 140 years, dispersed across a stellar volume your charts list as empty. We had a great deal of help from species your records list as exterminated, who are in fact mostly not. She folded her hands. The HFY are very good astronomers, High Lord. They were very motivated to help us hide from your sensor signatures, as were the Krell, as were the Doruset, as were the Maronites, as were. Stobbed. Re-stobbed. Tarsus Vale was very still on his throne. Above him the orrery turned, 40,000 worlds. He looked up at it now, slowly, and Alina watched his eyes track from light to light to light, and she could see on his ancient face the moment he began to count differently. How many of those, he said, are not in fact mine? At present, Alina said gently, approximately 900. Something in the High Lord's throat made a sound. It was not quite a word. You will have noticed, Alina went on in the same conversational tone she used in trade negotiations, that in the last 16 hours, 312 of your Imperial relay stations have ceased to transmit. There were no attacks, no explosions. The crews are alive. They have simply been informed that the Imperium's authority over their station and over the local stellar volume has been transferred. Most of them accepted the news without resistance. Some of them, in fact, had been waiting for it. For some time. Waiting, Tarsus Vale's voice was flat. High Lord, you have been ruling 40,000 worlds for 12,000 years. You have been ruling them through fear and through the very real threat of fleets like the Eighth. But you have not been paying attention to them, not in any way that matters. The Imperium delegated, the Imperium taxed, the Imperium punished. It did not ever listen. And in the dark, in the long quiet between your inspections, your worlds learned that we were listening. They learned that we were building. And they made, on their own, a great many small decisions about what they wanted to be when the wind changed. You turned my empire. No, Alina said, your empire turned itself. We just gave it somewhere to turn to. Tarsus Vale closed his eyes. 4 hands flexed once on the arms of the throne and then went still. Tell me, he said, about humanity. Alina considered the question. We're a young species, she said. 200 years ago, we discovered that we were not alone. 190 years ago, we discovered the Imperium. 188 years ago, we made a decision. What decision? That we would not be the 212th. He opened his eyes. You have been preparing, he said slowly, for 188 years, to meet me in this room, today. Approximately, yes. You knew I would summon you. We knew the Imperium would, eventually, summon someone. The script was very predictable. High Lord, 211 prior performances. We had time to read them all. And the threat I delivered was the cue we were waiting for. There was a silence in the Hall of Suns then that was different from any silence that had ever occurred in the Hall of Suns before. It was not the silence of awe or of fear or of grief. It was the silence of a tide that has, very suddenly, gone out. Tarsus Vale leaned forward. What, he said, do you want? Alina reached into her satchel and withdrew a single folded sheet of paper. A conversation, she said, and a signature. She set the paper on the arm of his throne. The High Lord of the Vorthak Imperium looked down at the offered page, and for the first time in 12,000 years, he was not certain what he would do next. The page was short. It was written in formal Vorthak in the left column, and in plain English in the right, and at the bottom there was a space for a signature and a seal. Tarsus Vale read it once, then he read it again, then he set it on his lap and he laughed. It was not the laugh of the court. It was not the laugh that had moved through the tears when he had threatened humanity with extinction. It was a different laugh entirely, quiet, dry, and very tired, the laugh of a being who has just been told a good joke at his own funeral. This, he said, is not a surrender. No, Alina agreed. It is not a treaty of vassalage. No, it is, he looked at the page again. It is a request that I keep my throne. It is a request, Alina said, that you keep doing what you're already very good at. The Imperium is not in many ways a bad construction, High Lord. It is durable. It is administratively coherent. It maintains roads and trade and a common tongue across 40,000 worlds. These are not small accomplishments. We do not wish to dismantle them. We wish to, she searched for the word, reorient them. Toward what end? Toward an end in which the Imperium's threat of extinction is no longer used as a tool of governance. Toward an end in which the species your records list as exterminated are permitted to be, openly, what they have quietly remained. Toward an end in which your fleets exist but do not glass worlds. You will remain High Lord, your court will remain your court, your orrery will continue to turn. She paused, but the lights it shows will be partners, not possessions. And if I refuse this request? Elena was quiet for a moment. High Lord, she said, in approximately 9 hours, the Reaver detachment will return to Vorthak Prime. They will find the orbital yards above this world surrounded. They will find the Spire's defense grid disabled. They will find their own command codes no longer functional because the engineers who maintain those codes have, for several decades now, been quietly answering to a different authority. You will not be killed, your court will not be killed, the Imperium will not be destroyed. But you will sign a different document in a less comfortable chair, and the terms will be considerably less generous than the ones I have just offered you. She gestured at the page. This version preserves your dignity. The next version does not. Tarsus Vale was silent for a long time. Why, he said at last, why offer me dignity at all, after what I would have done to your homeworld? Elena considered. Because we are a young species, High Lord, and young species learn from the ones that came before. We watched the Imperium for 188 years. We learned a great deal about what works in a galaxy this large. We also learned that 211 civilizations were not destroyed because the Imperium hated them. They were destroyed because the Imperium had no use for them as anything but examples. We do not want to live in a galaxy that runs on examples. We want to live in a galaxy that runs on use, and you personally, High Lord, are very useful. 12,000 years of administrative experience does not grow on a vine. We would rather not waste it. You are offering me, he said slowly, a job. I am offering you, she said, the same job, performed differently. He looked down at the page again. His 4 hands were very still. And the human ambassador, he said, what becomes of her? She goes home, Elena said, and writes a long report, and her government decides what to do with her. Probably they will give her a slightly larger office. Probably she will retire in 8 years and grow tomatoes. Tomatoes. They're a fruit, we argue about it. Tarsus Vale laughed again, and this time the laugh was a little less tired. He picked up the page, he read it a 3rd time. He took the seal from his throat, the seal that had ended 3 civilizations and 100 lesser things, and he pressed it to the paper, and the paper accepted it with a small, soft sound. He handed the page back to Elena. Ambassador, he said, tell your species that I am very glad we did not meet you 1,000 years ago. Why is that, High Lord? Because 1,000 years ago, he said, I would not have been wise enough to lose to you, and we would all be dead now. Elena folded the page carefully and put it in her satchel. High Lord, she said, you are too hard on yourself. You would have been wise enough. It would simply have taken longer. She rose from the chair. The chair sank back into the floor as silently as it had risen. She bowed, not the bow of a vassal, but the small, equal nod of one professional to another at the end of a long meeting, and she turned, and she walked out of the Hall of Suns for the 2nd and last time. Above her the orrery turned, 40,000 small, slow lights. 900 of them, she noted, were already a slightly different color. Elena Reyes' diplomatic transport lifted from Vorthak Prime at dawn the following day, in clear weather, with no escort and no fanfare. The Spire watched her go in silence. The honor guards did not stamp. The court did not gather. There was no recording. Across the Empire in the next standard month, the changes came. They were not mostly dramatic. A relay station's authority code updated. A vassal world's tribute schedule was renegotiated downward. A garrison was withdrawn from a continent it had occupied for 600 years, and the locals, who had been waiting 600 years, threw a festival that lasted 9 days and produced a song that would, eventually, replace 3 older anthems. The HFY returned to their official records. So did the Krell, the Doruset, the Maronites, and 41 other peoples the Imperium's ledgers had listed as concluded. Some of them were small now, some of them were not. The Doruset, in particular, had been very busy in the dark. High Lord Tarsus Vale remained on his throne. He retained his title. He retained his orrery, although the orrery was reprogrammed on his own quiet order to show the worlds in their actual relationships rather than in their imperial hierarchy. The 40,000 lights still turned, but they turned now in a pattern that was, an old Vorthak astronomer remarked, considerably more beautiful than the previous one. Tarsus Vale received the report. He read it twice. He did not comment. He gave one further public speech 6 months after Alina's departure in the Hall of Suns. The court was full again. The vassal ambassadors were present. They were not this time kneeling. There was no protocol for what they were doing, standing politely with their heads inclined in the manner of guests at a meeting, and the Spire's protocol officers had spent 2 weeks arguing about it before concluding, on Tarsus Vale's instruction, that there did not need to be a protocol. People could stand how they liked. In the speech, the High Lord said many things. He said that the Imperium was 12,000 years old, and that 12,000 years was a long time, and that long times had a way of making certain assumptions feel like laws of nature when they were, in fact, only habits. He said that some habits were worth keeping, and some were not, and that the work of any long-lived institution was the slow, careful sorting of one from the other. He said that the Imperium had, for a long time, used the threat of extinction as a tool of order, and that the tool had, on inspection, been making the order worse rather than better. He said the tool was being put down. He said many other things. The full transcript was widely distributed. It became in time required reading in 3,000 academies across the changed empire, and a passage from it, the passage in which he described, with a frankness no Vorthak High Lord had ever shown in public, the moment he had understood that the small woman in the gray suit was not afraid of him, would be quoted eventually in the founding charter of an institution that did not yet have a name, but which would, one day, replace the Imperium's central court with something less hierarchical and more conversational. He did not mention Alina Reyes by name. He did not need to. On Earth, Ambassador Reyes filed her long report. Her government read it. They did, in fact, give her a slightly larger office. She did not retire in 8 years. She retired in 11 because the work turned out to be more interesting than she had expected, and because the new institution did, in the end, need someone who had been in the Hall of Suns on the day the orrery had begun to turn differently. She grew tomatoes, she argued, occasionally and good-naturedly, with her neighbors about whether they were a fruit. On clear nights, she sat on her porch and looked up at the sky, where the points of light were no longer arranged into anyone's empire, and she drank her coffee while it was still hot, and she thought, sometimes, about the 7 words she had said in the Hall of Suns, or 8, she had never been able to decide. You have already lost, you don't know it yet. It had been true when she said it. It had been true for 188 years before she said it. It had been true in some quiet, growing way, since the first human had looked up at the stars and decided that the old story, the story in which great empires arrived and small worlds knelt, and the universe was a thing that happened to you, was not the only story available. Humanity had written a different one, quietly, carefully, across 2 centuries in the dark between stars, with help from the ghosts of 41 peoples who had been told they were dead. The galaxy turned, the lights moved. Somewhere, a young species was being summoned to a great hall to be threatened with extinction by an old and certain power. Alina Reyes hoped on her porch that they too would have time to finish their coffee. She suspected they would.